Hello and welcome to Indianomics. The Central Statistical Organization expects the economy to grow at 7.1% in this financial year, the GDP that is, but there is a big catch in this advance estimate. The impact of demonetization has not been accounted for. The Central Statistical Organization's head, Professor TCA Ananth, today released the full year projection, taking into account data from April to October. This puts the government in a bit of a bind ahead of the upcoming union budget. So the big question we are asking is, how will this impact the budget calculation as well? Joining me now in discussing the prospects of the Indian economy in the current year and the next, as well as the impact on the budget, are an eminent panel of experts. Professor M. Govinda Rao, former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, of the 14th Finance Commission and of the head of the NIPFP formerly. Professor Arvind Virmani, again former Chief Economic Advisor, member of the Monetary Policy Advisory Committee to the Reserve Bank. Also joined by Deepali Bhargava, the economist at Credit Suisse, and Sharmila Velan, the Deputy Chief Economist at Asianomics. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this analysis of the CSO's advance estimates. Before I begin the discussion, let us hear out the Chief Statistician, Professor TCA Ananth, on what kind of data he has included and why he has not chosen to include data after October.
I would like to draw attention to the estimate which is made in the area of financial services, insurance, real estate and professional services. In this category, one of the indicators which is used relates to the growth of bank deposits and credits, data for which was available for the full month of November. But in view of the government policy of denotification of notes, the volatility in the underlying figures, particularly the growth in deposits, was felt to be an outlier, and therefore a conscious view was taken not to include the estimate for November in calculating the estimate. This has marginally affected the overall estimate. I will be very careful in not speculating about what will be in the revised estimate. When I present an estimate and how I've examined the data and what approach I've taken, I will explain at that stage. At this stage, since it is in public knowledge that the November figures are available, the fact that we have not used them required me to comment, and I've done that. What exactly will be the approach and to what extent how will they be used in later revisions, I will leave for later releases.
All right. So practically for all estimates, it's only up to October that data has been used and extrapolated for the next 5 months. Dr. Virmani, let me start with you. How much would you rely on this data if it is not taken anything after November?
So let me make a couple of general points. The most important and obvious one is that this story is not just about demonetization, but also the shift in the budget by 1 or 1.5 months, which has necessitated this new estimate. So it cannot be compared with the estimates or forecasts from last year, which are based on 3 quarters, because these are based on 2 quarters. Now, this is an obvious, but it has the following implication, and that is that the protocols that they have developed were for a particular period. That is, they depended on what had happened till the end of the calendar year.
Yes.
Now, notionally, they, as Ananth has explained, they are applying the same protocol, but they may not be the best protocols if you are going to do every year in future this kind of 1 month accelerated thing. Okay. So that confuses things more than usual. Okay, that's, as I said, it's kind of obvious, but it needs to be said.
Fair point.
The second, So the second point, of course, you have emphasized a lot, and again, is clear to everybody now that this does not explicitly take account of the data emerging after the demonetization. But given my first point, and despite what Ananth has said, I am not sure that some of these effects, particularly what made me kind of sit up and notice was the trade, hotels and transport, where you have a significant decline in the growth rate. Now, that's the, as you may recall in my last discussion with you, I had said that that the immediate effect of demonetization would be on retail trade in goods, services, and daily labor. So I'm not convinced that there is no effect at all, because for the reason that the protocol is not clear and they may have had some flexibility in measuring that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll just get other people to comment on this as well. Deepali, what would your own data be? What are you working with now as GDP growth, and do the numbers released by the CSO influence it in any way? Deepali? Okay, I'll just get to Deepali in a minute. Sharmila, what are you working with as a GDP number for the full year, and do the CSO's numbers influence you?
Well, Lata, we don't really do GDP forecasts. We more look at countries, and in this case, India, in terms of where it is in terms of the business cycle and how the timing of the demonetization has impacted that. And the main driver of GDP growth over the last couple of quarters has been consumption, because the investment cycle is still very much, to show signs of decisively turning up because of the ongoing problems in the corporate sector, particularly the large private sector infrastructure companies, as well as the public sector banks. So the private investment cycle has been very weak. Some of it has been supplemented by public investment spending, but that's not enough. So with that being as it is, the export story being weak and consumption being the main driver, the demonetization in that sense couldn't have come at a worse time because of the implications it has for consumption, given that 86% of consumer transactions are in cash. So what we are looking at is a very sharp slowdown in consumption spending over the next 2-3 quarters, and on the back of that GDP growth. And we wouldn't put it beyond the realms of possibility that you actually get a quarter-on-quarter contraction in GDP.
Oh, contraction, quarter-on-quarter. So what would be a number
rather than year.
What would you work with as a likely GDP number for the full year, Sharmila?
As I said, it's about where we see India in the business cycle. So, the short-term outlook, the next 2-3 quarters, we've grown a lot more cautious, and that would bring down any estimate of overall GDP growth for the full fiscal year. But having said that, we are very positive about the India growth story in general in the medium to long term. And, the demonetization is a positive from a medium to long-term point of view, particularly for the budget and for cyclical tax revenues.
Okay. Well, Dr. Rao, what are your thoughts? The important takeaway from the CSO's numbers is that even without taking into account any of the demonetization months, since they were extrapolating from October, we still see the GDP growth for the GDP advance estimate coming down to 7.1 from 7.6% last year. If the demonetization is seen as a structural break, at least for the short term, then what may be the actual numbers, sir?
Well, I mean, you see, it's very difficult to predict what the actual numbers will be. But the fact of the matter is, as you mentioned earlier, you see, so far, even this 7.1% was sustained, by the growth of public consumption expenditure and private consumption expenditure. That public consumption expenditure is not going to be as much as it's going to. It was in the last 6 months. For the reason that the public sector wage increase that has happened is not going to play out in the next 6 months.
Yes.
And so everything will have to depend upon the private sector consumption, and that is the one which has been affected substantially. If you look at from the consumption side. So there is virtually no investment that is, public investment has been low. The private investment has not been forthcoming. So there will be a significant deceleration in growth So there is no doubt about that. I would not, my own feeling is that, again, since they have repeatedly said that they have not taken into account the impact of withdrawal of selected bank notes, the actuals will be actual growth will be much lower, and but nevertheless, possibly this is the growth rate, because since this is the growth rate they will basically base for their budget calculations, which is likely to have a very in many ways this is going to have going to be very unrealistic.
Okay, yeah, exactly, because the budget numbers indicated that they are working with an 11% nominal GDP growth, which would have taken the nominal GDP growth to 150 lakh crore. But what the advanced estimates indicate is that for the current year, the nominal GDP growth will grow at 11.9%, which is 152 lakh crore or 152 trillion. So already there is an extra number over there, making it easy for the government to meet its 3.5% fiscal deficit. So how will this impinge on the budget? That is the question I want to ask all of you in a minute after this break.